Before Nagash left for Cripple Peak, he made sure to leave behind agents of the mortuary cult within NEFERATA to help in corrupting the minds of the nobility and lure them to his side. One such agent was Vesoran, the high priest of the city of Lahmia. Using his elevated position within Lahmian society, he was able to corrupt the mind of the young princess NEFERATA, who was destined to become the next queen of Lahmia. NEFERATA was a willful girl who grew fascinated with magic and death, but was frustrated by the mortuary cult's unwillingness to pass on their teachings to a woman. Vesoran nurtured her thirst for the forbidden arts, coaching her in the magical knowledge he learned at Nagash's side. After the priest kings drove Nagash from NEFERATA was all too willing to save several forbidden scrolls from the priest king's piles. After her father took Nagash's position as King of Khemri, NEFERATA began her rule of Lahmia, and behind the locked doors of her palace, she studied the scrolls and began to emulate the simpler necromantic magics. All the while, Vesoran was testing the waters of Lahmia's mortuary cult, learning which priests were sympathetic to his cause and which would have to be dealt with in due time. Those who could not be twisted to the teachings of Nagash were warned of NEFERATA's dark practices, a calculated act of betrayal that the queen would not learn of for many years. So it was that the priesthood fractured, some loyal to their queen and others set against her. This culminated in an attack on the palace, a rebellion that was only thwarted when NEFERATA herself emerged, surrounded by a crackling nimbus of dark energy, and unleashed the full fury of her burgeoning necromantic abilities on her foes. The remaining rebels were rounded up and executed, leaving only those in the mortuary cult whom Vesoran could trust. With their aid, Vesoran and NEFERATA continued their studies, focusing on one ritual above all others: the creation of the elixir of life that had granted Nagash his immortality. They eventually found success, but in an unexpected form. The version of the elixir they created gave them immortality, but it also fundamentally changed the nature of their beings. They became the first vampires. As a consequence, the mortuary cult of Lahmia cut its ties with the mortuary priests of other cities and began a reformation of its principles, encouraging female priests to join. The temple was rebuilt using stones taken from the buildings of Khemri that were destroyed during Nagash's defeat, and the chambers of the temple glittered with gold and were decorated with statues and hieroglyphs telling the story of his rise to power. In time, this temple would be known as the Temple of Blood. The cults of the other gods found themselves falling out of favor, struggling to be heard at court, and forcing many to simply leave. Neferatem invited her cousin, Khalida Neferer, the warrior queen of Libaras, to join her cult. Khalida rejected her offer, suspicious of the changes going on in Lahmia and devout in her own worship of Asaf, the goddess of serpents. Worried that Khalida knew her secret, Neferatem accused her cousin of treason and attempted to assassinate her during a feast, drawing her into a duel before all the nobles of the Lahmian court. Neferatem's vampiric strength gave her victory, and whilst Khalida lay dying, the vampire bit her own tongue and kissed her cousin, transferring the vampire curse upon her. Devout Khalida prayed as she died, and her prayer was answered. Asaf drew the taint out of her blood and replaced it with poison, granting Khalida a holy death. It is said that although her death was holy, it was not complete, and Khalida lived on as the eternal guardian of Asaf's temple. Neferatem, thwarted in her attempt to gain a powerful ally, cast the remaining priests of the other gods out of Lahmia. During this period of change, Neferatem had been secretly feeding on the populace of her city, arousing the suspicion of Aborash, the love-struck captain of her palace guards. Aborash was horrified to discover his love's true nature, but he was still duty-bound to obey her commands as she was still the queen of Lahmia. Neferatem tricked Aborash into drinking from the elixir of life, turning him into a vampire, much to his disgust. Neferatem and Vesoran then continued to spread their curse to many within the Lahmian court this way, including Chief Judge Mahtmesis and the court vizier Harakt. So began her deathless court, the true-born who would become the masters of the lesser vampires they created. Aborash still felt twinges of his humanity from his former life, and created a set of rules for the true-born to follow, ostensibly as a way of protecting themselves from discovery. They would only prey on criminals and slaves, not ordinary citizens from then on. Also, they were forbidden from feuding amongst themselves, and no true-born could ever try to kill another true-born. Thus, when Neferatem's brother, Ushoran, learned of the elixir and stole a draught of it for himself, she could not punish him, and Ushoran, the lowly lord of Maskes, was permitted to join the Deathless Court. Under its ageless queen, Lahmia became a city known for its religious intolerance and the harshness of its laws. Agents of the other cities began stirring up rebellion, horrified by the spread of the cult of blood and its veneration of Nagash. When the insurrection came, it was more brutally suppressed by Neferatem than the previous rebellion, earning her the name NEFERATA, meaning beautiful death. Although the rebellion failed, the other cities of Nehekara still wished for Lahmia's destruction. King Setep of Kemri, whose military legions had conquered lands as far north as the lands of the border princes, was foremost within this coalition. Amongst his soldiers was a masterful tactician called Vashanesh, who was of Nagash's own blood. Betraying Setep, Vashanesh traveled to Lahmia to warn them of this planned attack. Vashanesh so impressed Neferata that she gave him the last of the elixir of life, which none have been able to recreate since, and made him her husband, king of Lahmia and co-ruler of its growing population of vampires. Together they plotted to keep the other cities of NEFERATA distant from each other, creating a network of spies that split the nation for centuries, disrupting all attempts to unify the people against them. After centuries of uncontested rule, it was Al-Khadizar the Conqueror who finally managed to unite and mobilize the disparate armies of the land and bring war to Lahmia by invoking the names of the old gods of Mehekara. He laid siege to the city at the head of a mighty army comprised of warriors from all of the other city-states, as well as mercenaries and allies from the territories he had annexed from the lands of Araby and the Southlands. Arriving at the city, they were horrified to be met not only by the military of Lahmia, but also by an army of the dead raised from their rest by the vampire Vasoran. Fighting back their fear, Al-Khadizar's troops brought battle to the undead. Though outnumbered, the army of Lahmia could be continually replenished, the dead rising as soon as they fell. The vampire's mortal followers proved less reliable, however, and in time, traitors amongst the Lahmian ranks soon turned against their masters and allowed the Nehekarans to storm the city. The chariots of the Jackal squadron of Mahrak coated the streets with blood, and those vampires who did not flee were forced to do battle on the steps of the temple itself. Aborash led the defenses for a full week, withstanding the spells of Zandri's high priests and the alchemical fire of their war machines. Finally, the temple was burned to the ground, and Aborash was forced to flee with several of his sons in darkness. The last of his compassion for the living finally burned out of him. The other surviving vampires, including Neferata, Vasoran, Ushoran, Matmasis, and Harakt, fled north, where they came across a reborn Nagash in the midst of raising an undead army of his own.